So I'm continuing with the Stairs of Queen Anne project, and I'm going to be working on the trees. And a lot of leaves, a lot of the trunks of the trees, the shading, and eventually going to be working on a brick wall, which requires a lot of detail. But not there yet. This video is accelerated because it's pretty slow moving. In reality, I'm painting a lot of individual leaves, and I'm starting with light touches and going back for more darks to create some shapes and some shadows. And I'm using a variety of greens here. I've got sap green and a little bit of hookers, some olive green. I'm adding a little bit of black and a couple of different browns. There's raw sienna, burnt umber, and I'm also throwing in some sepia. Occasionally, there's touches of yellow ochre in this. And for the brighter leaves, of course, I'm going into some cad yellow to make my green a little bit brighter. And here and there, toning things down with just a little touch of Chinese white, because it will bring that intensity of that color way down. And it kind of pushes it back a little bit. But what the shapes of the leaves are repetitive if you're working on one type of plant consistently, but even so, you have to feel the organic nature of it and try to, create that feeling in your brush stroke, and not do anything just repetitively. You want to keep changing up, keep changing the mix on your brush, working around in different areas, and trying to put in as much variety as possible. It looks like a daunting task at first, but I've got a lot of white that I saved by using the resist material, and so it's very easy to see the color as it goes on the paper. The lights generally go first, and occasionally I have to throw some darks in just to see how it's going to play out. But there are many other approaches to this. I could have wet the paper and just let that color flow, but I'm losing control of it that way. So my option is to use kind of a wet mix and keep an eye on that and put a light layer down, and then as that light layer begins to dry, I add a little bit more color to it. I have a lot of variation in my colors, and I'm not trying to outline a leaf. I'm trying to let them blend together somewhat on the paper, but as I'm working, I want to make sure I control that. Just to see what I've got, occasionally I'll work on the tree trunks themselves, and in this instance, I want to try and keep my brush strokes going in the direction of the tree would grow kind of up and down, and where you would see those irregularities on the bark. I want to keep as much texture as I can, so I'm very careful about the application here. And when I do put down something that doesn't agree with me, I'll do a lift using a paper towel. I just get a clean paper towel and put it down over the color and just pick it up. And it's pretty simple. It'll pick up most of your color, and if it doesn't, you can just add water, just plain water, to the color in the area that you want to lift. Let it sit for a minute, and then put your paper towel down on it, and it will soak up almost all of the color so that you're back to square one and you can paint again. It's not exactly erasing, but it's pretty close to it. Now on the back side of the, away from the light on these trunks of these trees, I want them to be pretty dark, and I'm using some sepia, burnt sienna, and some of the darker brown mixes. I've got in places I'll put in a little bit of orange, and on the highlights I'm using some yellow ochre and I even on the back side of these, away from the light to create shadows, I'll use some blues mixed in with the browns, because blues tend to create a shadow effect. And a nice addition to that is a little bit of alizarin crimson. Alizarin crimson and black will give you a nice gray. And the mixture of the browns, the crimson, and black will give you a lot of different variations of grays. And that is something that you see in these tree trunks. And these tree trunks, of course, have a lot of color in them. And I want to just keep experimenting with that and allow some layers to dry, work in other spots, and then come back to them and put overlays on it. If you want a darker value, let it dry and then come back with a darker mix and go over the top and create your next layer. On the light side of these tree trunks, I want to make sure that I leave the paper really light, and I can't get it back if I make it too dark, so unless I do more lifts. So I need to stay away from that and determine where the leaves are casting shadows after I finish all of the leaves. And that is the tedious part, but you just have to keep going back for different mixtures and painting over and over and over. And it is a bit monotonous, but once you get in a groove, you start getting a feeling, and you kind of develop this organic kind of motion that just generates these things. And you get into the kind of a system of applying the light areas and then going back while they're still wet and adding slightly darker values and building it up. And there was a lift, and if it's very simple to remove color if you've gone too far, which is not hard to do. So I continue with changing my mix, and I'm using, as I said, a lot of the various greens like sap green, hooker's green, olive green, and then I'm adding to that some ochre and a little bit of the burnt sienna, occasionally a little bit of sepia, and creating all these different hues. But it's primarily, I guess, if anything, there's a predominant color here, it would be sap green with just all sorts of variations to create the darker values. I'll touch the black in places, and that has the same effect as adding like a Chinese white. It's going to reduce the intensity of the color. It's going to really flatten it, and it won't have as much punch. So it moves it back, and sometimes that's a good thing. If you're not trying to draw too much attention to an area, and if you want to decrease the intensity of your color, that's a good way to move it back in your painting. So as this video progresses, you'll see that I'm just repeating those same processes as I work all over this paper in the area of the trees, and I'm just building more and more and more leaves. And up at the top, when we get up to the top, it's a little brighter color, there's a little more sunshine, and there's also more light striking, so it gets a little more intense, and probably adding a little more yellow to indicate that there's some sunshine hitting. And when you have light, you have to have dark near it to create that effect. So I'm also working in, for shadows, some of the olive green and some of the hooker's green, and it does a nice job of complementing the sap green for the color, for the shadows. But I'm going to let this run for a minute, and I'll be back to talk more about working on the base of this tree, the trunk of the tree. So working this section, my idea was to kind of delineate the bark and I'm doing that with, it's got a mix of alizarin crimson and there's some burnt sienna, a little sepia, and it's almost a purple or lavender hue. There's some alizarin crimson and black involved, and there's a mix of many others, but you don't want to be afraid to use color even in shadow. So building up on the back side of the tree, it's going to be fairly dark. It's going to be one of the darkest areas, and as you work around to the sun side, where on the left, that exposure, it's going to be much lighter. So there are many variations of brown in this. There's a lot of raw sienna, raw umber, sepia, and variations are created by adding a little touches of alizarin crimson. There's some blue on the shadow side and a little touch of black here and there, which helps create those deeper pockets where you really want to create a shaded effect. So we have this tree in the foreground, and anything in the foreground is going to have a little bit more intensity to the color. So I really wanted to bring out all these colors here. And then as you get further and further away, your eye doesn't discern all of the various shades quite as well as it does when something's up close. So those colors are going to be a little flatter. You won't see all this detail. But this is kind of a fun section because you get to essentially draw with a paintbrush. I'm putting in tree bark, and back in the background there, I'm kind of dragging my brush a little bit and using a dry brush technique to create textures on the trees that are further away, and a few are in deep shadow, and as I said, there'll be less and less detail as we work further and further away. Predominant color that I'm using in the tree in the background on the trunk is going to be raw sienna, and it's a little bit of a yellowish brown, and because the sun is striking the trunk of the tree. And here I'm kind of fleshing those out and showing where the limbs would be, and eventually those will also have a lot of leaves, but I need a little bit of a scheme, so I'm kind of essentially drawing those in with the paintbrush and putting in some limbs, and just going to be covering a lot of it up, but it gives me an indication of where these leaves need to be, and it also helps me so I don't overpaint, which could be easily done. I could just paint leaves until everything disappears, which I don't want to do. Now there's some stuff in the background way up the street. It's some big bushes, and then there's this little house. It's on the far right. You can barely see at the top of the street, which was just done with muted tones, a little bit of rose madder that was very dilute, and I want those to be very faint, those colors that are far away. So that was my thinking in creating that brick tone for the house that sits way back in the far right there. And then I'm now working some of the leaves that cover these trees that are further away, and they're going to be less specific. Those are going to not have the delineation all of these in the foreground do. Like some in the foreground look like you can see individual leaves. In the background, not so much. They're smaller brush strokes because they're obviously going to be smaller leaves. And now I'm doing a hedge, and the hedge is the paper was much wetter, and I'm allowed that color to kind of bleed and move around, and I'm working over the top of this brick wall that I've drawn in very carefully, and some of the brickwork is now being sketched in, and I'm dragging a brush with a kind of a pinkish mixture and adding a little bit of dark, but not much. As you can see, I'm lifting there, and then I'm adding more detail to it, and I'm following my lines of my drawing because I want to be careful about the perspective, that I don't flatten this out. So I have to remember where the vanishing point is and follow those lines. And you can see I'm dragging a dry brush through a lot of it and following that angle. And I'm not going to see much in terms of individual brick in the very back of this painting. There's a wall, and there it steps down as it comes to the foreground. I'm kind of creating the outline of the wall by the greenery that grows above it, and some of the darks that are within that space kind of create the shape of the wall itself. The wall, of course, is going to go all the way down to the sidewalk, and then there's a hedge. And the hedge is actually one video all by itself in the next release here in this series, and I'll show you exactly how I do that. And it was kind of fun to paint. This hedge here was much looser technique than what I've used in other parts of the painting. As you can see there, you can see where it's been painted wet on wet, and the paint has been allowed to kind of do its thing. It's kind of traveled and blended a lot on the paper. So there's that tree trunk way in the distance, and now I'm putting in some shadows on the sidewalk that'll run across the sidewalk between the trees, and it helps to create some depth as you're looking up this sidewalk into the distance, and you can see that tree trunk and the wall that's far back. Now I'm wetting down this part of the wall and using a bigger, like a 1/4 inch, it might be even a half, and putting in some light washes for layers. There's a lot of application here of various colors, and at this point I'm letting it dry. After this dries, we're going to begin doing some overpainting, the next layer. So the next layer, just touching this wet paper, and this is when you have to be really aware of the amount of moisture that's in your paper. So I've got some dry brush going on in the distance, and there's some light areas that I don't want to lose. And then in the foreground, the paper's wetter and the color is blending more. So I'm allowing that paper and kind of watching the paper, and I'll have to be aware of the moisture factor, because if you work on paper that's too wet, your color just is going to go everywhere. And if you are working totally dry, then you're going to have so much texture, you may not want that effect either. So it's somewhere in between. I kind of like, so I have a little bit more control. I do like the color to blend together, but I don't want it going everywhere. So I'm working that area, and as the paper dries out, you have a little bit more and more control. And did a little bit of a lift, and I'm going to be going down to a smaller brush, and I want to be creating the brick appearance. And you can still notice how the brush strokes are following the lines of my drawing. So they're angling down toward that vanishing point. And now these bricks are all of various colors, so I'm just spotting in some of the various tones that I saw and working them throughout, and keeping in mind that the color that's closest to you is going to be the most intense. the deepest. So allow those to prevail. Don't wipe them out totally, and then the ones in the distance, you want to kind of play those down. So we keep working to the foreground, and I'll get my head in the way so no one can see what's happening. And I really had my nose in it. I like to get close to my work. So the area right below the wall is going to be a hedge, as I was talking about, and it will create its own shadow against the wall, but it's a nice way to set off this brickwork. And it was there, so I'm not just inventing it, but it really helps in the composition to have that. All of this brick wall is butting into this big pillar that's in the foreground, and the pillar is a job in itself, so it's almost like a separate painting. And I'm going to be taking that on after I finish the hedge. I like to, my brother always tells me, do the worst first whenever we do a job together. And that's kind of one way to approach painting too. You do the stuff, you do what's the biggest challenge. If it's in the correct sequence, you want to take on those challenges, and you'll feel good about it once you get them completed and you move on to things that are a bit more fun. I actually like doing this kind of stuff. The brick is fun. I start seeing it as though I was there, and that's the way you want to feel about it. You want to feel like, what was your experience, and how did it, what did you take away from what was the feeling that you got from looking in this scene? And if you can convey that, then you're really doing your job as a painter. This is something of an interpretation, and I've changed the composition a little bit, not a heck of a lot. I've taken some liberties with where the trees are, and of course the leaves and some of the trunks of the trees and things like that. But as far as the brick wall goes and the gate and so forth, that was pretty much exactly what I drew and what I saw. I probably omitted quite a bit of the trees so that there could be some sky, and it helps the balance of the composition, because there's going to be quite a bit of concrete and brick toward the lower portion, and the light sky kind of offsets that. So I'm still working that as it dries, and I'm doing a lift. And of course you have to look at something after it's set for a bit, because watercolor changes considerably as it dries. The colors are not so deep and intense, of course, and they flatten out, and you can tell if you need darker values or whether your value range is okay. And in this case, it required a little bit more color as it went away, a little darker as it's moving back into the distance toward the street above. It's funny how reds and oranges can work as a shadow color at times. Like there's some burnt sienna to this brick, and it doesn't make it come forward. It doesn't project like you might expect those kind of hues to do. They actually kind of recede and work their way into deep shadow, and they're very effective. So spatially, those colors work in shadow and they work in light, both. So it's not, your palette isn't split between warm and cool colors, and warm colors being advancing colors and cool colors being receding colors. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the warmer side of your palette will work very well in shadows. So I'm working here on continuing with the sidewalk and the shadows that are cast across it. And nearing completion of that wall, and I'm going to be painting some of the leaves and foliage that's above the pillar that's closer to in the foreground. And so the leaves are fairly light in this case. The pillars, the two pillars that are in the foreground, are really going to take center stage. I don't want these leaves to attract too much attention, so they're kind of soft, they're light in value, and they're not very distinct. They kind of, your eye kind of completes the equation when it comes to those things. But they're important for the background. And working on these capitals, these concrete balls that sit on top of these pillars, it's really just a case of painting a sphere, which most of us have done many times. And you have to determine, of course, where your light source is. And the sphere is a mossy one, and it's going to be grayed and green and kind of grungy looking because of all the time and all the moss and water and everything that's affected it. So it's certainly not a clean, bright piece of masonry. It's going to be mossy. Now, on the light side, I want to keep it kind of bright and pink, and then if we move away, it's going to, from the light on the dark side of the moon there, it's going to get darker and darker, and we create that three-dimensional look. And that you want the paper fairly wet because these colors need to bleed together a little bit. There's, in terms of color scheme, there's a little bit of Davies gray in there because Davies is a nice gray green, and there's a little bit of black mixed in with the other greens that were used, like the hookers and the olive. So those are all effective for creating the look of that concrete ball. And then the top of the pillar has moss growing all over it. So that starts off with just kind of a light layer of sap and olive green, and then there's a little bit of highlighting